Hello everyone, and welcome to the new user training session. My name is Diane and I will be your host during this session. What you're looking at is the Vulkan main screen, Vulkan 6XP main screen. When you start Vulkan, this is the screen that will appear. What you're also looking at is this small aqua area that we're going to call the tree, and the larger white area which we call the grid. The first step that you do when you've loaded the Vulkan program, you will have created a database connection. Created a database connection to the Vulkan XP database. In this case, you're looking at my screen and I have created a database connection called local. In your case, you may have used your company name or possibly your own name, but it's just a description that you give the database connection. What is a database connection? Well, a database connection, if you'll look at it or think of it as a vault or a filing system, it contains all of your projects, all of your jobs, all of your items, and all of your shop setup like seams, materials, connectors. It also includes all of your specifications and pressure files. They're all inclusive in one database connection, Vulkan XP. So once you've created your connection, then at that point you're ready to add projects, jobs, and items and get yourself ready to cut out Vulkan fittings using the new Vulkan 6XP program. We'll start at the top and we'll start from left to right as though we're reading a book. Well, as you can see, we've already created the new database connection. In my case, it's called local. So we're going to go on to the next icon. That's new project or category. The one after that is a job, and the one after that is new items. So as you're hovering over the icons, it actually gives you a description, a brief description of what that icon actually pertains to or what that item may pertain to. That's what we call flyover text. What I'm first going to do is going to create a project, a job, and an item or two just to show you how quick you can get up and running using new Vulkan 6XP. So we're going to go ahead and create a project, and we'll call this project Diane. What do you do presently in Vulkan? After you've created your project, you create a job. So we'll go ahead and create a job, and we'll call that Diane Job. And at this point, now you're ready to add some items to that job. So we'll go ahead and add an item or two. Let's do a piece of duct, and we'll make that 10 by 12. And we'll say OK, and we'll add an elbow, and we'll say OK, and let's do one more, and we'll OK that fitting, and now we'll exit. We'll assume we're finished with that job. At that point, what is your next step? Well, I select Process the Job, and I look at the icon in the middle of the screen like a puzzle. It looks like a little puzzle piece, and you'll select Process the Job. Once the job is processed, then you're able to print your labels and print your reports. That's how simple it is to add a project, a job, and a few items to go with that job. Again, we will go over this in a much slower pace in just a few minutes. The next area that I'd like to cover is actually your setup information. Setup, options. Options takes you to the first screen. It wants to know what type of options you normally do, what your shop normally does most of the time. These are system-wide settings. They can be changed on a project or a job or an item basis, but you need to set them up to begin with so that each and every time you create a new job, you have a system default that it's set to. So if your segmenting method normally is multiple full sheets, select that here. Also, with new version Vulkan 6XP, there is no additional option for manual segmenting. That is automatic. That is part of the Vulkan program. It's not a separate option any longer. Optimizing method. That's just you're telling the computer how do you want to optimize the job. If you select high, that will give you the best metal utilization. And really, low and medium is probably not needed any longer. It was followed through from previous versions when computers were much slower. So at this point, everybody should really leave their optimizing method on high. Again, whether or not you want a process liner and whether or not your metric input. The next screen we'll go on to is labels. Here's where again you'll set up what your system or what your shop normally does. You can override this on a job by job basis, but right here you're setting up, does your job normally print sheet labels? Does it print ID labels? Does it print standard duck labels? Does it print vein labels? It's asking you, what do you do normally? In the section here on metal options, if your shop has not previously printed sheet labels, you may want to just try that. Just try a sheet label, because now on a label, on each sheet label, it actually prints a plot of that sheet. So if you were used to plotting your metal, printing a plot of metal, you may want to just print your sheet label and get that same little diagram on a sheet label. The general options wants to know whether or not you want to use original job color. This is used when you're doing copying items from one job to another. You can keep the original job color. Whether or not you want metric labels, whether or not you want to print decimals. Previously, Vulcan printed their sizes, their blank sizes, and the sizes around the fitting using sixteenths. So if it was 10.5, it would have printed 10-08. At this point, if you'd like decimal, you can select print decimal labels and you'll get 10.5 printed for your blank size or the fitting size. Print ID and vein labels at the end. Print your sheet labels at the end. Print separator labels. Separator label is another shop preference. Whether or not between label types, for example, between your standard duck labels and your metal labels, do you want a separator? Between your metal labels and your vein labels, do you want a separator? What that will do is once it changes from one label type to the next, it will actually do a form feed and start a new page. So that actually gives you some a shop. If let's say you give your vein labels to some other area in the shop, you would not want your metal labels to be on that same sheet. So that's what a separator actually does for you. Again, whether or not you want to print metal labels and whether you're printing your liner labels. And then there are some liner options as well. The next tab is reports, and we really won't go over that report from this area because there's another new interface that we will be looking at when we get over to the other screen. The next section that we're going to cover is shop setup. We'll select shop setup and we'll go over some of the various changes between new version Vulcan 6 XP and your previous versions. We'll select metals, and from here you'll see that you have a list of your materials or your metals. All list boxes are alphabetized. Well, you're looking at the screen and saying, well, how does galvanized come above aluminum? Well, you can trick the program and give it a character that is above an A. So in my case here, I actually put space galvanized so that galvanized becomes at the top of my list. I use galvanized the majority of the time, and I don't want to have to drop down that list box and pick that material each and every time I set up a job. So I actually gave it a space in front of it. We'll go on to the Gauges tab. For each material, you can set up an unlimited number of gauges. As far as sizes, you can actually set up as well unlimited number of sizes, and that follows through in most areas in the Vulcan program. You can have as many metals, as many liners, as many seams, as many connectors. It's unlimited at this point. Now what you do see is that there are no deletes. You'll see very, very few deletes. So in order to use, let's say, some scrap material, you need a way of telling Vulcan, I now have that in stock, and then when you no longer have it in stock, another means of turning it off since there's not a delete. So what we've used here is what's called an active box. You will mark each one of these sizes that you do have in stock active. And if you don't have it in stock any longer for this moment, then just uncheck the active box, and for galvanized 28 gauge, it will only use a 60 by 120 sheet size. It will not use 48 by 96 because it is not active. And that's how you can add different size ranges, maybe even, again, some scrap sizes as well. Going back to metals, you can see that we've color-coded the material. Each material you can designate a particular color for that label or for that material, so that at a distance in your shop, we'll go ahead and pick pink, at a distance in your shop you can tell each material on your labels. Now, we've also done that for liner. Each liner material can also be color-coded. Now, what some of customers have been asking is, can the thicknesses be color-coded? Well, in this case, the answer to that is no. You're only color-coding a material type, a liner type or a metal type, not the gauges nor the thicknesses. They are not color-coded. Eventually, this has been requested quite a bit, so eventually that's probably one of the things that we will be adding. But at the moment, we're just color-coding the types, the material types. The next step, or the next area in data that we're going to go to, is seams. In seams, for instance, let's select Pittsburgh. What you had before is you had a light seam and a heavy seam. Now in Vulcan 6XP you can do what I call chaining your seams. For instance, let's take this example, Pittsburgh. When the gauge changes, when you've reached a max gauge of 20, then it will automatically, the next seam that it will select will be a large Pittsburgh. Well, if I go on to the large Pittsburgh, you'll see that the max gauge for large Pittsburgh is 16. So when it's heavier than 16, it would automatically pick a welded. And I can again continue on and on and on, seam after seam, chaining them together. But in this case, welded, there is no max gauge and there's no next seam associated with that as well. As far as the other areas in the Vulcan shop setup, they're relatively self-explanatory. We will look just briefly at connectors. We'll look at a slip and drive. We'll go to the Basic tab. Relatively, you're seeing exactly the same thing that you've seen before. You've got your corner and you've got your V-notch. New in shop setup for most areas is costing. You can actually get a manufactured cost of each item in your Vulcan data. I believe that's about all we need to cover in shop setup. So at this point we're going to go back to Vulcan and fittings, and we're going to go at a much slower pace for input. So we're going to go back to the Diane job. Let's double click like a Vulcan standard. And I'd have those 3 items presently in the job that we started out with. If I want to edit one of these items, all I need to do is double click. When I'm editing, the OK button will come up in yellow, letting you know that you are editing a fitting. I'm going to go ahead and add some more items to this particular job. All I need to do is press the Add New Items. Brings me again to that user screen. From here you can see that each item on my user fitting screen either has some number designation, a letter, a word, or just some sort of number associated with it. And that is what it's asking down at the bottom of the screen, keyboard input. If you've named these particular fittings, you can actually use your keyboard and enter in the input name for that particular item. So if I press a 2 and enter, that's going to bring me to a radius throat radius, heel, elbow. If I enter in some dimensions, once I'm finished, just like it has before, it will bring up a preview screen. If you want to add a hole in Vulcan presently, you would, before you OK a fitting, you would want to press the Modify box before OKing a fitting. When you OK a fitting in Vulcan, it has laid that fitting out in its entirety. So if you make any changes to a fitting and you come back and edit it, you will have to do those modifications again. If you're just coming back to look, just to review your fitting, then don't press the OK button when you're in Edit. Just press the Cancel button. But let's go ahead and add a hole to this particular radius, throat, radius, heel, elbow. So we're going to say OK. It'll bring up a screen. Do you want to modify the blanks now? And I will say yes, and that will bring me to Flat Pattern Modify. We do have a demo that's more in-depth about holes, so we're not going to cover it in its entirety. I just wanted to show you a very brief pointer on adding a hole. The bottom two left icons are actually the holes icon, rectangular hole and circular hole. You can also use the three above. However, these bottom two are designated holes to put the hole, compute the hole, the center of that blank raw. So if you have any allowances, seam or connector allowances, it will remove those and calculate the center of that blank. So if I select the circular hole and put in a 6-inch diameter, it is going to place that hole directly in the center of its raw blank. When you're finished entering your hole, then you just say Save and Exit, and it takes you back to the input screen. The next thing I'd like to show you is, where do you name those fittings? Where do you put a name on a fitting? Well, you name that from the defaults. Each fitting has an input name and a report name. So if you don't like the name square elbow, then all you need to do is give it a new name for the report. And when you're printing reports like a shipping list or a fitting count list, it will print whatever name you have so designated in your defaults. The input name, same thing. It'll just use that input name whenever you're inputting a fitting. You'll use the number 1 instead of the normal 153. There are numbers beside every elbow or every fitting. So for instance, if I change to a radius throat, radius heel, that number will also change. And these are really used mostly for service personnel, just in case you're reporting something to do with a fitting and we need to know exactly which fitting you're talking about. So we've actually given each and every fitting a number. One thing that you can do that's new in version 6 is, remember I said when a fitting is, you say OK to that fitting, it is laid out in its entirety. So if a fitting needs to be segmented, it's going to tell you that immediately when you say the OK button. So in this case, I'm going to make this oversized. And when I do so, and say OK, it will tell me that this fitting is oversized and needs to be segmented. Now for just a radius throat, full radius throat, radius heel, elbow, you have the option of selecting automatic breakup. What is automatic breakup? Well, automatic breakup will try to keep you from having to segment that fitting. It will make this fitting into a maximum of 4 non-90-degree elbows. You'll have 2 45s, 3 30s, or 4 22s.5. So if you say attempt automatic breakup, it takes you back into the input, and if we were to look back at the grid screen, you'll see that I have 3 identical non-90 elbows. That's the only fitting presently that we do automatic breakup. We plan to add that as well to an offset, and I'm sure that that will come in very handy by having that on offset fittings. The next screen I want to go to is the round screen. Well, you look at this screen and you're asking me, where are all my fittings? I don't have a scroll bar like you had one before. Well, what we've done, instead of having a conglomeration of every body and every tap that we have, we've actually decided just to put the body styles on the screen. So once you select your body and enter in the dimensions for that body, then you're ready at this point to enter in a tap. If the body style, once you've selected the correct body style, for instance, do you want to produce the body in the tap? Do you want to just produce the tap? Or do you want a saddle? So once you've selected the correct body style, then at that point you're ready to go and enter a tap. It brings you to the tap screen of all the available taps for that particular body style. And we'll select one of the taps and we'll make this a 6-inch and we'll say OK, and then we'll do another tap. We'll do one more and we'll make this one 6 and we'll make that 10 and we'll place it on the opposite side. And we'll also make this 7 and we'll say OK. Now what you're looking at is the body and 2 taps. You can again also add as many taps as that body can hold. There are no limits. One is red and one is green. Why is that? Well, depending on which row you select will highlight the applicable tap. So if you had several rows here and you didn't know which tap was which, all you need to do is select the row and it will actually make the tap red. Once you're finished, you say OK, and now you have a body and 2 taps. That same holds through with the oval. We have just put the body styles on the screen, and once you enter your body, then your taps will actually display at that point. We'll go back to the rectangular page, and we'll do an example of, let's say, a piece of duct. We'll make this 36 inches long. Now in this case, 36 inches long, 24 by 24 does not require reinforcing. However, now in version 6, you can actually add reinforcing on the fly. So all you need to do is press the reinforcing tab, and you can selectively pick any reinforcing that you want to add manually. When I go back to the input screen, you'll see now that I have joint rod reinforcing on both ends. So you just can go to the reinforcing tab and either add reinforcing manually, or you can remove reinforcing by just selecting reset from specifications. For example, on this case, this did not, from the spec, did not require reinforcing, and I could have just come back over here and reset and it would zero everything out. I can also go back to input, and to the right of the joint I can turn which reinforcing I no longer want. So that's one new good thing in version 6, where you can actually have reinforcing on the fly. Add it or remove it, whichever you so desire. Another new feature is scopes. You now have 6 different scopes associated with a job, with each and every job. The last 2 are what we call user-definable scopes. You can use these last 2 scopes in any manner that you so desire. We actually do not have sketch and piece name like you're used to in version 6. We've just added more scopes, and if you want to use the user 1 and user 2 as a sketch and piece name, you're welcome to do so. So let's go ahead and add a scope here. Let's just call this return. And we'll add. add a drawing. And we'll add a floor. So now you can set up several different scopes associated with each and every job. When I say OK to this fitting, actually I need to go back to scopes, because what I just did was I created and selected scopes for just this one particular fitting, unless I say save as job default. So if I want the scopes that I have selected here to be selected for this fitting and any subsequent fittings thereafter, then I want to say save as job default. So you can have different sets of scopes in a single job. Just like you had different sketches, you can have different scopes in each job. So when I say OK to this fitting and do another fitting and select the Scopes tab, you'll see that those same scopes will apply to this fitting. If I want to add a new one at this point and call this Supply, and I want this fitting only to be Supply, then I'll say go back to Input, save the fitting, and when I do another fitting, it will not be Supply, it will be Return, because I did not save as job default. It's just going to save whatever I had as a default to begin with. So you can select a scope on an individual basis, or you can select the scope on this individual basis and all subsequent ones that will come up to that point until you change them again. So that's how you add different scopes. Once you're finished entering all the fittings that you want for a job, you'll say OK to that and exit out of Input. Now we're going to come back to the main screen, and again we're ready to process the job. Once we process the job, then at that point we can